Introduction to the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth in the Bible is an incredible masterpiece of storytelling. It's a story within a story within a story. So if you're keeping track, that's 3 stories. Story 1 is the story of Naomi, a widowed woman living in a foreign country. She begins the story being emptied of everything of value, yet ends the story being filled with joy, reflecting her value. Story 2 is the story of Ruth, a Moabite widow who demonstrates incredible loyalty to her Israelite mother-in-law. This is a story of a restricted foreigner being weaved into the people of God. Ruth's kindness and loyalty is the picture of God's loyalty to his people. Story 3 is the overarching story of God working behind the scenes to bring about the redemption of the world. Story 3 can also be called an allegory. It's a story of God working through ordinary events to highlight his loyalty, kindness, and grace. And through this, we can see so many wonders that have come to pass, specifically the allegory that is related directly to how Jesus' salvation came to all of us. The very first line in the story of Ruth provides both the setting and the tension within the story. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So this verse places the book of Ruth in the time of the judges. It also signals that something is off. There is a famine. In the book of Judges, there is a leadership crisis in the land. There is an often repeated line throughout this book, the book of Judges. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This line initiates the start of a repeated cycle. The beginning of the cycle always starts with Israel committing sin. And then God allows Israel to be oppressed or to be ruled over. And then Israel repents and cries out to God. God then sends a judge to deliver Israel, and Israel is faithful to God while that judge lives. But then that whole cycle continues again and again. It's eventually broken. We see when God places an earthly king over Israel, but then a whole new set of problems occurs. The last few stories in the book of Judges shows just how messed up things were during that time. It shows how far the people living in the promised land had strayed and the social chaos that ensued. The book of Judges ends with the line, Israel had no king and everyone did as they saw fit. The leadership crisis was not the only issue, though. The land was experiencing a famine, and it prompted a man named Elimelech to move his family away from God's promised land and to settle in the land called Moab. And there are 3 quick things to see here. First, famine in the land of Israel was an indication that something was wrong, because God had promised if you obey the covenant, he will bless the crops. Conversely, if you neglect the covenant, the crops will fail. Deuteronomy 28. Secondly, Elimelech's name means God is king, and he was living in a time when Israel had no king. So we see some craftiness, some irony here in the writing. Yes, words do matter. So be on the lookout for dual meanings and repeated words. Third, the land of Moab has multiple meanings. Moab has a stormy past with Israel politically and socially, but Israel spent important time encamped on the plains of Moab. So there are several other things that we know about Moab. First of all, in Genesis, we read that the Moabites are the descendants of Lot and his eldest daughter. You may remember Lot. Perhaps most famously, Lot's wife was the one who turned into that pillar of salt when she looked back on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We also know that Moab was the location of a place where Israel sent a message to, asking them permission to travel through that land on the way to the promised land, and Moab refused Israel entrance. We read about that in Judges 11. We also know that Balak was the king of Moab, and he hired Balaam to curse the Israelites. We read in Numbers 25 that Moabite women seduced Israelite men into worshiping foreign gods, and therefore a plague of 24,000 happened and a plague killed 24,000 as a result of that happening. We read about Moses dying and being buried in Moab. We know that all of Deuteronomy takes place in Moab. It is in Moab that Israel renews the covenant. We also know that Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord and becomes subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. So, in the midst of the political and social crisis of Judges, God inserts the book of Ruth. So, think about that timeline and plop Ruth in there in the midst of Judges, of all of those things going on. The story highlights the fact that God has not given up on those who were in a covenant relationship with him. Much like Jesus using the story of the Good Samaritan to shock the listeners, because you'll remember the Jews in the New Testament looked down on the Samaritan, God uses Ruth the Moabite as a symbol of loyalty. The Israelites, God's covenant people, were not living up to the covenant. However, Ruth, the foreigner, displayed amazing loyalty. One last thing to set the stage for the book of Ruth. It is important to know a little background information about the covenant made in the book of Deuteronomy. Ruth makes an important allusion to this, to Deuteronomy 28 through 30. During the time of the judges, Israel was dropping the ball on their end of the covenant. They were failing so bad that famine entered the land, and Israelites, like Elimelech, were leaving the promised land. In Deuteronomy 28 through 30, God told the Israelites that this would happen. He also promised that after they left, he would still restore them and return them to the land. On top of all of that, he would also make them flourish once back in the land. It is interesting that the location where the people made this covenant was in Moab, the place where Ruth is from and where the story begins of Ruth.